The air in the tenement apartment was cold and tasted of old cigarette smoke and the desperation of impending eviction. Leo sat hunched at the chipped Formica table, his shoulders tight, his gaze locked on the final notice from the bank. His hands, once capable of drafting clean, detailed blueprints for small, functional homes, were now clenched into useless fists, shaking with a tremor that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with failure. He was 34, lost, and the poverty that had haunted their family for 3 generations was about to swallow him whole. Across the room, Sam, lean and weathered like an old fence post, was methodically packing the last of his belongings into a worn duffel bag, a gesture of surrender to the road, to the life of a drifter he could never escape. Sam was the everyman, good-hearted but fundamentally lost, his core, latent skill, with engines dormant and useless against the weight of debt. They were down to their last $100, their stomachs rumbling with that hollow ache that only existed when the end was truly in sight. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant wail of a police siren, a sound that always felt like it was coming directly for them. They had nothing left to lose. And then the letter arrived. It was delivered not by a debt collector, but by the legal system itself. Thick cream paper, embossed with a notary's seal. It contained the final, shocking fragment of a family they had never known. An estranged, forgotten great-uncle Silas had passed away. He had named the 2 failed brothers, the 2 poorest men he knew, as the sole inheritors of his only asset, a remote mountain cabin, a derelict shack on a vast, unforgiving tract of Appalachian land. The inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a final, cruel joke, a rotten cabin for 2 rotten lives. But the question, the sudden, massive what if, hung suspended in the stale air. Why them? Why this cabin? What danger, what mystery, what ancient debt could possibly be attached to a worthless piece of property miles from nowhere, a forgotten place nobody had ever claimed? The letter was cold, hard proof of a life that was about to turn from simply tragic to terrifyingly dangerous. The journey was an endless, grinding climb, a ribbon of broken asphalt that abandoned the relative safety of the highway and dissolved into a rutted, overgrown logging track. Leo drove his battered old pickup, the engine straining under the collective load of their entire remaining existence, every mile taking them deeper into the kind of country where the trees grew too close together and the shadows never quite lifted. The atmosphere shifted from simple remoteness to something truly isolating, an oppressive silence that the rumble of the truck only seemed to amplify. They were leaving the world behind, trading their failed lives in the city for a deeper unknown. The truck finally gave a sympathetic cough and died to a halt on a small, overgrown clearing. The path was choked with aggressive weeds and fallen timber, forcing them to proceed on foot. The cabin stood alone, a dark, silent sentinel against a looming mountain face. It was far worse than the lawyer's faded photographs had suggested. This was no rustic retreat. It was a ruin. The porch steps were a hazardous pile of rotten lumber, and the entire structure sagged like an old man's shoulders, the roofline broken, the shingles curled back like peeled skin. It confirmed their deepest fears and their chronic ill luck. The inheritance was a practical joke, a final, cruel reminder that poverty was their birthright. They pushed the swollen front door open, and the smell hit them, a heavy, immediate mix of mildew, dust, and something metallic, like old rust or dried copper. Yet, as the sun began to sink, and the first true darkness that only existed far from city lights bled into the small, single room, Leo felt a strange, cold compulsion. He wasn't looking at a shack. He was looking at a riddle. He ran his hand over a hand-hewn timber in the wall, noticing the meticulous joint work. Too clean, too precise for the rest of the slapdash construction. This was the work of someone with a core, hidden skill, a man who had intentionally built a secret. He was staring at the undeniable sign of meticulous, hidden purpose that utterly defied the cabin's derelict exterior. This was the only contradiction in a life of failures, and it was the single spark that suggested their great-uncle Silas hadn't left them a tomb, but a key. The night was a grinding misery of hunger and cold, and the brothers huddled near the massive stone hearth, the only source of heat in the cabin. Sam, the practical but perpetually restless one, was feeding the meager fire with scavenged branches, his eye drawn to the rough-hewn stones of the chimney breast. He was inspecting the old fireplace, trying to find a clear flue to stop the acrid smoke from burning their eyes. It was an instinctual search for utility that led to the first break in the mystery. His hand brushed against a particular masonry block on the back wall of the hearth. It looked identical to the others, gray, soot-stained, and rough, but somehow felt smoother, unnaturally uniform in its placement. He pressed against it, a simple motion, and the stone gave way with a faint, scratching whisper of aged mortar being disturbed. He pulled the block out, revealing a perfectly constructed hidden compartment, a dry, airtight space just large enough to cradle a few secrets. Inside, there were two objects, both brittle and smelling faintly of sulfur and time. The first was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and its script impossibly tight and delicate. The second was a faded, half-crumpled piece of vellum, a partial map or blueprint covered in precise, technical markings that looked like engineering schematics, but also bore strange, cryptic symbols that resembled a personal code. Sam's heart, usually numb to any feeling resembling hope, gave a hard, immediate jerk. This was not the ordinary detritus of a dead recluse. This was a message. Leo snatched the journal, his eyes devouring the spidery script of their great-uncle Silas. The sheer effort put into concealing these items, the meticulous craftsmanship of the hollowed wall and the specialized mortar, immediately raised the stakes from a ruined shack to a desperate inheritance. The blueprint seemed to focus with intense detail on the structure of the subterranean geology directly beneath the cabin floor, with a large, unlabeled cavity marked by a single, ominous X. This paper was the ultimate contradiction to the cabin's derelict exterior, a sign of meticulous, hidden purpose designed to be found only by a determined hand. The journal was not merely a collection of notes. It was a window into a life they never knew, a life consumed and ultimately destroyed by a singular, blinding obsession. Leo read the spidery script aloud to Sam, the words painting a portrait of their great-uncle Silas Thorne, a man who was, by all evidence, an archetypal underdog. Silas was, by trade, a brilliant, self-taught mining engineer, possessing a preternatural gift for reading geology, for seeing veins of ore and seams of coal where established, formally trained, and well-resourced surveyors saw only bedrock. Yet, his talent was his undoing. The entries, beginning in the late 1930s, chronicled Silas's existence, a continuous, grinding cycle of poverty and brilliant, unpatented ideas. He wrote with a fierce moral conviction, detailing how his claims were repeatedly jumped, his patents ignored, and his promising career systematically sabotaged by a shadowy, pervasive entity he referred to only as the Syndicate. Silas was the family's secret shame, the crackpot uncle who forever chased fool's gold and ended up ruined. This was the dark wellspring of their generational misfortune. Their current, crushing debt was not an isolated event. It was a simple, modern echo of a historic corporate malice that had always targeted their name. The journal revealed that Silas's entire adult life was spent fighting to prove that his failures were not due to incompetence, but to conspiracy. His final, feverish entries were focused on a single, massive undertaking, proving the existence of a lost gold reserve that the syndicate had illegally sealed to evade treaties. He wasn't just a poor man, he was a blacklisted man, whose legacy of theft had been carefully engineered by those in power. His last words in this section, written in ink that had faded to the color of rust, were not those of a broken man, but of a man laying the groundwork for a patient, terrifying act of historical revisionism. He hadn't been searching for gold. He had been building the case to steal back the truth. As the brothers devoured the journal's details, tracking the agonizing history of their great-uncle's downfall, the world outside, the world of institutional power and shadow, was already beginning to pay attention. The atmosphere of isolation that had initially felt like a defense now felt like a curse. They were so focused on the secrets buried beneath the cabin that they almost missed the single chilling sign that their discovery was already compromised. Sam, restless as always, stepped outside to gather more firewood, his eyes adjusting to the deep green of the surrounding forest. He noticed a slight disturbance on the dirt track leading up to the cabin, a subtle, unnerving detail that jarred against the wilderness. Mixed in with the ruts from their old pickup were the clear, wide, expensive treads of a modern, heavy vehicle. The track stopped short of the clearing, turned around neatly, and drove away. The inference was immediate and terrifying. Someone knew they were here, and that someone wasn't local. A few miles down the mountain, tucked away on a paved logging road, and almost swallowed by the thick brush, a dark, imported sedan was parked discreetly. It was the kind of car designed to be invisible, its color muted, its windows tinted deep black. A man in a tailored, expensive suit sat in the back, the very picture of detached, well-resourced menace. He wasn't local. He was watching the dust motes dance in the late afternoon sun, waiting for the signal to approach. The man pulled a small, encrypted satellite phone from an inner pocket. The call he placed was brief, a coded message to a massive corporate headquarters hundreds of miles away. The message was simple and absolute. The two poor, low-value Thorne brothers were currently occupied with their inheritance. This first of the institutional antagonists was calm, meticulous, and confirming the existence of the threat. The danger they faced was not a local bully or a simple trespasser. It was a ghost from the past, now manifested in the form of a modern, efficient, corporate machine. The dramatic irony was complete. The brothers were consumed by an old man's journal, completely unaware that a much more immediate, modern power had already drawn a tight, professional net around their broken cabin. The journal demanded their full, rapt attention. Propped up on the rickety Formica table, its brittle pages seemed to pull the light from the cabin, focusing all reality onto the spidery, desperate script of Silas Thorne. He began his act of historical revisionism with the year 1941, detailing his life not as a string of failures, but as a meticulously orchestrated campaign of sabotage by external forces. Silas, it turned out, hadn't just been searching for gold. He had been hired by a consortium, the entity he scornfully dubbed the Syndicate, to conduct a discreet survey of this very mountain range. His talent, his uncanny ability to read geology, led him to an impossible discovery: a colossal, lost gold reserve unlike anything recorded in the state. The vein was so rich, its size so staggering, that it would have immediately triggered federal and state intervention under newly implemented wartime resource laws. The syndicate's reaction was not excitement, but sheer corporate panic. To avoid sharing the fortune with the government, they hatched a ruthless, efficient plan. They would not mine the gold. They would conceal the treasure entirely. Silas, ironically, was instrumental in the cover-up. As their brilliant, low-level engineer, he was tasked with designing a sophisticated, layered concealment system, a secret vault built deep into the earth. Once the work was done and the gold was sealed, the syndicate rewarded his service by ensuring his silence. They fabricated a series of small, unrelated thefts, framed Silas for fraud, and had him blacklisted from every mine in the country. They destroyed his career, his reputation, and his life, effectively stealing his claim and his future. The syndicate was not just a corporation, it was a conspiracy, and the journal was Silas's final, slow-burn vengeance, the key to the truth buried beneath a mountain of lies. Armed with the knowledge that the cabin wasn't merely a shack, but a cleverly disguised lockbox, the brothers' attention turned from the journal's history to the flawed blueprint. Leo, the failed planner, felt a familiar, dormant instinct begin to stir. He analyzed the map's strange symbols, realizing the measurements and markings corresponded not to the room's layout, but to a precise depth measurement, pointing toward the core of the foundation. They needed to get beneath the main living space. The floorboards were old and warped, groaning with every step. But Leo noticed one large section was suspiciously uniform, its fit too clean compared to the haphazard, shoddy repairs surrounding it. Using a pry bar and their combined strength, they started the painstaking, agonizing work of pulling up the planks, trying to mitigate the noise that echoed unnervingly in the oppressive silence. Beneath the loose wood was not bare earth or a simple crawl space, but a thick layer of concrete. Again, far too much effort for a simple frontier cabin. But it wasn't a continuous slab. The section the blueprint had highlighted was a perfect 6-foot square patch, its edges barely visible where the cement met the rough foundation wall. Working in the growing heat, they chipped away the crumbling mortar along the seam. The entire concrete section, they realized, was not a pour. It was a single, heavy slab designed to camouflage what lay beneath. Working together, their muscles screaming with strain, they managed to pry and slide the concrete aside. It revealed a perfectly circular, industrial-grade steel trapdoor, almost 3 inches thick, its metal blackened with age. It was bolted to a concrete collar beneath the earth. This was not a simple root cellar. This was a specialized structure, too expertly engineered for any ordinary purpose. The steel was cold, unyielding, and spoke of immense, deliberate concealment. The discovery marked the true start of the journey, transforming their inheritance from a ghost story into a physical reality, secured by a brilliant mind preparing for a long, silent war. The thick steel trapdoor was finally heaved open, its heavy metal lid groaning in protest against 8 decades of rust and silence. It did not reveal a simple cellar floor, but a sheer, inky vertical shaft dropping into absolute darkness. The air that rushed up from the hole was foul, a terrifying blast of stagnant water, decaying wood, and a heavy mineral tang that stung their nostrils with the promise of decay and untold pressure. It was this stench, and the sheer, unsettling depth of the drop, that truly introduced the threat of the unknown. Sam, the everyman, felt the paralyzing grip of claustrophobia immediately. He stumbled back, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. He muttered about the air quality, his memory flashing to Silas's journal entries, warning about the risks of the deep earth, the consumption, the old frontier term for the fatal lung ailments that quietly claimed miners. The high-risk environment was immediate and palpable. Leo, however, the seeker, felt a different kind of pull, the gravity of the mystery. He ignored the rank, sulfurous air, focusing instead on the walls. The shaft was perfectly square, lined with meticulously reinforced, old-growth timber, showing the deliberate care and immense expense Silas had poured into his secret. Leo secured a thick, sturdy rope to the collar and, taking only a powerful LED headlamp, began his slow, difficult descent into the earth. The light cut through the gloom, showing the tight confines of the walls pressing in, demanding total concentration. 50 feet down, the air grew marginally cleaner, but the walls felt closer, tight and suffocating. He landed on a small, cramped staging platform. Looking down, the shaft continued, another steep drop. But leading off this platform was a choked, horizontal passage. It was the first, terrifying barrier, an entrance expertly sealed with rocks and mud, designed to look like a final, unbreachable end. The engineered concealment was not just protection for the treasure, it was a psychological test. Leo spent the next day and a half in the tight, oxygen-starved shaft, his body aching from the sheer intensity of the labor. He had to earn this discovery through pure, unglamorous effort, chipping away at the seemingly impenetrable debris wall that blocked the horizontal passage. The work was brutal, suffocating, a true test of the underdog's spirit. He soon realized the barrier was constructed not of simple, jumbled rubble from a natural collapse, but of heavy, custom-cut, interlocking stone blocks. It was an engineered marvel, designed with a structural integrity far exceeding what was necessary to simply seal a tunnel. Silas hadn't sealed a mine. He had constructed a specialized, bomb-proof vault door meant to withstand geological shifts and centuries of neglect. This was proof of the engineer's paranoia and his absolute commitment to his secret. Finally, driven by the desperate need for vindication and a belief in the mystery, Leo managed to carve a small, shoulder-width passage through the lower part of the seal. He squeezed through the tight gap, crawling on his belly, and entered a low, winding horizontal tunnel. The air here was cool and dry, a stark, pristine contrast to the damp, moldering shaft he had just endured. The ceiling was reinforced with thick, old-growth cedar beams, their joints still perfectly tight. But the tunnel was only an antechamber. It opened abruptly into a circular, steel-reinforced chamber, a veritable bunker. And set into its far wall was the final, most terrifying barrier, a massive, old-world safe door made of wrought iron and banded steel, secured with a gigantic external wheel lock. There was no handle, no place for a simple key, and the sheer scale and engineering of the door defied immediate entry. Leo ran his hand over the cold, unyielding metal. The journal was right. This was not a simple mine. It was a time capsule, a treasury secured by a brilliant, paranoid mind, demanding a key or a code only Silas could have possessed. The threat was immense, and the obstacle was absolute. The cold, unyielding face of the wrought iron vault door only amplified the urgency of Silas's written words. Leo and Sam returned to the journal, turning to the bitter, meticulous account titled, simply, Chapter 12. This was Flashback 2, the Syndicate's grip, detailing the institutional cruelty that had crushed their great-uncle. The year was 1948, and Silas had made his critical discovery and filed his preliminary claim for the land. But before he could finalize the crucial paperwork, the syndicate moved with ruthless efficiency. The syndicate's head at the time was a man named Elias Haraway, a ruthless, ambitious industrialist whose name would later become the foundation of a massive corporate empire. Haraway didn't bother with simple theft. He orchestrated a complete dismantling of Silas's life. Through a series of carefully placed bribes and legal manipulations, the syndicate fabricated a lien on Silas's few existing assets, creating a crippling debt that was impossible to pay off. They didn't just steal the claim. They used their vast, well-resourced power to make Silas an example. They had him arrested for fraud on a trumped-up charge related to his original survey work, tying him up in a legal battle that drained every penny he possessed and permanently blackened his name. This was the source of the family's generational poverty. Not mere bad luck, but a targeted act of corporate malice. The journal entries were heavy with the weight of betrayal, establishing the antagonist as a force of history and institutional might. Silas vowed then to reclaim his honor, dedicating the next 40 years of his life not to simply mining the gold, but to securing it and building the unassailable legal case to prove that the Haraway Corporation was built on a foundation of lies. The syndicate had stolen his property, his reputation, and his life. The final pages of this section were a desperate vow for vindication, establishing the thematic repetition of justice that now rested squarely on the shoulders of the two poor brothers. With the massive, silent vault door now the new, absolute focus, Leo and Sam meticulously searched the cabin again, treating the space not as a ruin, but as a carefully constructed, final piece of Silas's life work. They were looking for the iron key their great-uncle had cryptically mentioned in his notes. Sam, who possessed an instinct for finding things where they didn't belong, a skill wasted on his chaotic life, began the patient process of dismantling the few pieces of furniture that remained. He started with an old, rotting cedar chest, prying apart its dovetailed joints, finding nothing but decades of dust and mouse nests. He moved next to a small, built-in shelf where a single, oversized, leather-bound Bible had been left, the kind of relic that belonged to a family that still believed in something. He flipped through the yellowed pages, finding only verses and the faint, unsettling scent of sulfur that permeated the cabin. But as he ran his hand along the book's spine, he noticed a subtle rigidity, an unnatural thickness that defied the book's age. The leather was slightly puffed up, almost imperceptibly. With a delicate touch, Sam used a small knife to carefully cut into the inner lining of the spine. The work was slow, requiring a steadiness of hand that Sam rarely displayed in the daylight world. Inside the compartment, nestled in a bed of faded velvet cloth, lay a single, unique, tarnished iron key. It was heavy, its metal cold and densely cast, its head forged into a distinctive, complex pattern that clearly matched a non-standard lock. It was too large and intricate for a simple padlock. It was the key to a mechanism, not a door. The key Silas had mentioned, a tangible piece of evidence that had been waiting for them. Sam held the key in his palm, feeling the weight of the secret, the dense metal a perfect symbol of the complex defense Silas had prepared. The key did not fit the vault door's main gigantic wheel lock. The brothers realized the door was a multi-stage puzzle. This key must be for a secondary, hidden mechanism, a specialized bypass or an internal failsafe designed by the engineer himself. They were one critical step closer, but every ticking second brought them nearer to the danger they knew was circling just outside the tree line. The tension of being watched, which had been a faint, abstract hum, finally surged into a focused, alarming reality. The brothers, now operating on sheer nerves, had established shifts, alternating sleep with watchful silence. It was just after 2 a.m., the hour when the mountain's silence is deepest and the world feels most brutally exposed. Leo, on watch, saw it first, a pale, flicking light approaching through the trees, moving too low and too methodically to be a wandering animal or a casual hiker. It was a lone figure, moving with a chilling, professional silence, carrying a focused, tactical flashlight. The man was lean and weathered, dressed in dark, expensive-looking field gear, clearly a professional instrument of the institutional power, not a local. He was a syndicate security consultant who specialized in discreet retrieval. The brothers immediately extinguished their small lamps and froze, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against the hollow silence of the cabin. The figure paused at the edge of the clearing, his flashlight sweeping the perimeter with a slow, calculating patience. He saw the disturbed ground, the fresh tire tracks, and the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke that clung to the air. The man, a true antagonist, clearly viewed the occupants as incompetent, easy targets, just two desperate poor men who had stumbled onto a secret they lacked the capacity to hold. This was the moment of dramatic irony at its peak. He did not know they had read the journal. He did not know they were armed with a secret that dated back 80 years. He spent 20 agonizing minutes searching the immediate perimeter, missing the subtle signs of the trapdoor because Silas's camouflage was too perfect. Finally, satisfied that the two squatters were merely asleep and easily manageable, the man knelt and planted a small, high-tech listening device near the foundation. He retreated silently into the darkness, his confidence in his own superiority the only sound in the night. The brothers waited until the sound of his footsteps had vanished completely, their muscles aching from the strain of holding perfectly still. They had passed the initial test of fire, but the threat had officially materialized. The morning after the midnight visit was charged with adrenaline and a fierce, cold resolve. The security consultant, an instrument of the antagonist's will, had shown his face. The brothers knew he would be back, likely with backup, expecting to find two terrified, simple men. They had to use their underdog status as a temporary weapon. First, they gathered the non-essential supplies they had dragged up the mountain: old tools, half-empty canned goods, a worn flannel shirt, and intentionally left them in a scattered, chaotic pile on the porch. The mess was calculated, designed to suggest they were still focused on superficial survival and planning to return soon. They wanted the man to think they were near, still naive. Next, they moved the essential items: the journal, the blueprint, the iron key, and a small bag of food. They descended into the shaft, but did not stop at the final vault door. Using their innate, intimate knowledge of the immediate area, gleaned from Sam's childhood explorations, they located a small, hidden ventilation shaft that Silas had brilliantly concealed in the far corner of the subterranean staging chamber. It was narrow and choked with spiderwebs, but it led to freedom. They used their local knowledge, their single advantage over the well-resourced professionals, to effect their escape. The shaft opened into a dense, thorny thicket a quarter-mile from the cabin, a spot no one using a direct line of sight would ever find. Before leaving the woods, they worked meticulously, creating a believable false trail, a broken stick, a shallow, intentional footprint, leading away from the thicket and toward the most inhospitable, impassable section of the mountain. They were gone. When the syndicate man returned with his team an hour later, they found the cabin empty, the detritus scattered, and the false trail leading directly away. The professional was visibly furious, his initial assumptions of their incompetence shattered. The two poor brothers had utilized their lifetime of hardship and deep knowledge of the wilderness to outmaneuver the corporate machine. They had successfully transformed their poor status into a lethal, tactical advantage, disappearing into the vast silence of the mountain they now called their own. Running blind through the dense mountain forest, using old game trails and compass headings, the brothers finally completed a wide circle, utilizing their deep knowledge of the terrain to evade the pursuing security detail. Their goal was never to escape the mountain entirely, but to escape the immediate perimeter and then return through the subterranean route, using the cover of the dense night to slip past the antagonists watching the perimeter. Under the cover of the absolute blackest night, the moment when the moon was hidden and the stars offered no aid, they slipped back down the narrow ventilation shaft and into the main vertical chamber. They were no longer simply reacting. They were on a mission fueled by desperation and a desperate hope for vindication. Leo secured the tarnished iron key he carried and approached the massive, silent vault door. He had studied the mechanism detailed in the blueprint and knew the key was not for the main wheel lock, but for a hidden, specialized bypass, a final failsafe the engineer, Silas, had installed. He felt for the tiniest indentation on the lower band of the door, a nearly invisible keyhole, and inserted the intricate metal key. The key clicked home, a small, loud sound in the absolute quiet of the tunnel, triggering a powerful, unseen, spring-loaded bolt. With a deep, grinding sound of gears that had not moved in 80 years, the final barrier was breached. The immense external wheel lock suddenly began to spin freely. With a unified grunt of shared effort, the brothers turned the heavy wheel. The seals hissed, and the great, iron-reinforced door swung inward with a heavy, echoing groan that resonated deep in the earth. The air that rushed out was clean, dry, and cool, a pristine contrast to the dank tunnel. The passage opened into a large, silent void. This was it. They had reached the inner sanctum. The absolute silence in the tunnel was replaced by a tense, overwhelming anticipation, broken only by the sound of their ragged, disbelieving breathing. Leo raised his powerful LED lamp into the darkness beyond the great safe door. The light cut through the gloom, revealing a space that was not a simple tunnel, but a massive, impeccably engineered chamber, a cavern of unnatural size, defying the imagination of what could be built beneath a single, unassuming cabin. The walls were lined, not with rough-hewn rock, but with meticulously fitted stone blocks, built to contain a treasure and withstand the pressure of the mountain itself. This was the hidden chamber, the place where Silas had executed his patient, 80-year revenge. But the light's focus was immediately arrested by the chamber's contents. Lined up in neat, continuous rows that stretched back into the deepest shadows were hundreds of old, heavy wooden crates. They were large, clearly military-grade supply boxes, dating back to the 1940s, sealed with brittle, dark red wax, bearing a symbol the brothers didn't immediately recognize. The sheer volume was staggering. This was not a cache, but a treasury. Driven by a nervous, almost frenzied energy, Sam seized the closest crate. He saw that its wax seal was cracked by time. He worked a small pry bar underneath the lid. The old wood groaned, and the lid came off. Leo shone the lamp inside, and the chamber filled with a warm, impossible, dazzling light. Inside the crate, stacked so tightly they seemed poured, were hundreds of raw gold nuggets and bars. They were of an unnatural size, gleaming with the rough, untouched brilliance of wealth beyond comprehension. This was not just gold. It was a mountain of it, organized, cataloged, and sealed. They had not found a simple mine. They had found the colossal, national-level reserve that the syndicate had secretly sealed away to evade federal law. Their poverty was not just over. It was being vaporized by a fortune that could restart a small country. The silence of the mountain was now filled with the silent, terrifying gleam of wealth. The initial, dizzying shock of the gold gave way to a cold, frightening calculation of the discovery's scale. Leo reached into the crate and pulled out a smaller, ingot-sized gold bar. It was heavy, dense, its weight an impossible contradiction to the flimsy shack above them. On its surface, he found the irrefutable physical key to the entire conspiracy, a deep, clean stamping of a unique assay mark. It was a complex, 5-digit serial number accompanied by the distinctive, stylized initials WMD, Western Mining and Development. Critically, there was no official government or U.S. mint stamp, confirming Silas's entire desperate account. This gold was utterly pre-government assay. It was a secret, untaxed, unrecorded reserve, its existence known only to Silas and the most powerful founders of the syndicate. Sam tore open a dozen more crates, confirming the contents were uniform. This wasn't a few $100,000, a fortune they could simply melt down and walk away with. This was a colossal reserve, likely in the billions. The true danger was not the gold itself, but the political high stakes attached to it. They realized they weren't just poor men who had stumbled into money. They were now the custodians of a historic corporate crime. The exposure of this hidden wealth would not just ruin the Haraway Corporation, it would invalidate decades of land deeds, corporate mergers, and political maneuvering built on this fundamental lie. The institutional power they faced was not a criminal gang, but a pillar of American finance and influence. The moral weight of the discovery crushed the simple joy of wealth. They had the physical gold, the value that could buy them any life they wanted, but without the legal means to prove ownership, and without the courage to face the powers guarding it, it was merely a massive, terrifying secret. The gold's ultimate value was not its weight in ounces, but its power to bring down the immense, unseen corporate structure that had consumed their family. The immense pressure of the golden secret and the fear of the silent enemy outside focused Sam's mind with an unnerving clarity. While Leo guarded the evidence, Sam, driven by the need to identify the enemy, returned to the final, most cryptic pages of Silas's journal. Silas had been paranoid, and he had protected the full identity of his betrayer with a simple substitution cipher on the pages describing his legal adversaries. Sam, who had wasted years playing logic games and solving crosswords, used his dormant skill to break the code quickly. The full name of the original syndicate's leader was spelled out in cold, certain ink: Elias Haraway. The name was immediately recognizable to Leo, who snatched a discarded, week-old newspaper from their meager pile of insulation. Haraway. The name was now synonymous with immense power, the institutional face of one of the largest conglomerates in the nation, the Haraway Corporation. The newspaper provided the terrifying connection. Haraway Corporation was currently engaged in a massive, high-profile land use lawsuit against a small environmental group, a suit aggressively attempting to claim ownership over vast, historically protected tracts of federal mountain land directly adjacent to and potentially encompassing their own small claim. The pieces slammed together with a sickening certainty. The corporation was quietly attempting to secure the old treaty land, precisely to cover up the existence of the chamber, to legally secure the centuries-old lie. The antagonist was not a ghost from the past or a shadowy cabal. It was a living, breathing, ruthless corporate entity that controlled everything from mining rights to lobbyists in the capital. They were fighting not against a forgotten secret, but against a powerful modern empire built on that single lie. The stakes had been raised again. They weren't just fighting for gold. They were fighting a legacy of institutional theft that stretched across generations, and the corporation's latest public move was the final, terrifying piece of evidence. The sheer, impossible gleam of the gold bar sitting on the table became a violent contradiction to the poverty and the moral vacuum surrounding it, immediately creating a brutal rift between the brothers. Leo, the pragmatic planner, whose spirit had been broken by financial ruin, looked at the undeniable wealth and saw only salvation. He paced the small cabin, his voice low and desperate. "This is our second chance, Sam. We take enough, maybe 5, 10 crates worth. We melt it down, disappear, and start a new life. We're finally free." He saw his redemption solely in the value of the metal, arguing for the survival that had eluded them for so long. Sam, however, saw the gold not as currency, but as the enduring symbol of their great-uncle's stolen life and the family's systematic destruction. His heart was now hardened, not by despair, but by a fierce, driving need for justice. "No, Leo. Silas didn't seal this up so we could be low-level thieves. He did it so we could prove they are the thieves. This gold is the evidence that the entire Haraway Corporation is built on a foundational lie, a crime that has poisoned our family for 80 years. The argument was fierce, born of decades of shared pain and frustration. Sam gripped the heavy journal, his voice rising with moral conviction. If we take the money and run, Silas's name remains blackened, the family remains broken, and they win. We have to expose them. We have to prove Silas was right, not just for the money, but for the vindication. He convinced Leo that the gold's ultimate power was not its weight in ounces, but its power to bring down the institutional lie. The choice was stark, immediate, selfish survival, or a dangerous quest for generational justice. They agreed on the only path that honored Silas's legacy. They needed a credible witness and a safe location to present their undeniable proof: the unique stamped gold bar and the full, annotated journal. The thematic repetition of justice over profit had won. The air inside the mountain cabin had become a high-stakes intelligence center, thick with the tension of waiting and the metallic scent of old radio parts. They desperately needed a way to anticipate the movements of the syndicate's security detail, and Sam, driven by the urgency of their cause, was pulling on a long dormant part of his past. He remembered the crude, bulky ham radio equipment their great-uncle Silas had left stored in the attic, a collection of vacuum tubes, coils of wire, and analog gauges. It was old technology, but it might be untraceable, working for hours in a focused silence. Sam managed to jury-rig the ancient receiver, his innate skill with electronics suddenly clicking back into place. He meticulously tuned it, slowly sweeping the frequency band he suspected the professional security consultant was using for his secure satellite bursts. The static was maddening, a wall of white noise that seemed designed to mask the truth. The breakthrough came late that night. Sam picked up a distinct digital burst, a sophisticated rhythmic pulse of coded data that was clearly military-grade encryption. He couldn't break the encryption, but the pattern was clear. He listened for another hour, meticulously tracking the frequency and the length of the data packets. The transmissions were growing more frequent, and the length of the coded message was increasing. He looked at Leo, his face grim in the faint glow of the radio's tubes. "They're not waiting for a legal distraction," Sam whispered, his voice tight. "This isn't just surveillance anymore. The antagonists are moving. The data suggests an urgent command for immediate extraction." The threat was no longer theoretical or historic. It had become absolute, physical, and imminent. The institutional power was preparing to move from monitoring to a forceful seizure of the gold. The time for deliberation was over. The chilling implication was clear. The next step wouldn't be a quiet search. It would be a final, violent conclusion. They had mere hours before the silent war they were fighting broke into the open. The chilling urgency of the intercepted communication demanded an immediate, desperate strategy. They couldn't go to the local police. The Haraway Corporation's influence, as outlined in Silas's journal, ran too deep, too institutionally. They needed a witness who operated outside the compromised system, someone with the moral and academic weight to counter a billion-dollar lie. Leo, driven by the final, desperate surge for vindication, spent a frantic hour researching on his old, sputtering laptop. He found the name, Professor Elias Eldridge, a retired historian and former state geologist. Eldridge had published several dissenting, controversial papers over the years on early 20th century mining corruption, papers that specifically and repeatedly cited the original Western Mining and Development, Silas's syndicate, as operating outside the law. Eldridge was known for his fierce moral conviction and a history of fighting institutional power that had cost him his professional ease. The plan they formulated was audacious, a high-stakes gamble. They would take a single, small gold bar, the one with the unique, unforgivable assay stamp, along with the complete, annotated journal. This was the irrefutable proof. They would make an immediate 200-mile drive to Eldridge's secluded university town. They would lay the evidence out, not as a desperate plea, but as an undeniable historical fact. The truth of Silas's life work and the validation of Eldridge's controversial theories. The decision was absolute. Sam secured the gold sample and the journal in a hidden cavity in the truck, treating the heavy metal bar with the reverence of a religious relic. Leo, preparing the truck for a high-speed off-road escape, felt a cold, focused calm descend over him. Their poverty had given them nothing to lose, and Silas's genius had given them the weapon. They were leaving the mountain, not as terrified inheritors, but as agents of historical justice. The silence of the early morning was shattered by the syndicate's movements. Sam, maintaining a final, anxious vigil on the ham radio, picked up the last, unambiguous command. Secure the asset. Neutralize all unauthorized personnel. Moments later, 2 black, unmarked SUVs, expensive, silent, and powerfully built, roared onto the main logging road. Leo threw the pickup into gear. Instead of driving down the main, obvious access road, he wrenched the wheel hard, driving the old truck straight off the track and into the dense, overgrown forest, following the rough, barely there logging trails he and Sam had identified on the map. The cinematic action erupted instantly. The syndicate men, professional instruments of the antagonist, were used to paved roads and clear lines of sight. They were immediately at a crushing disadvantage in the unpaved wilderness. The chase was brutal, a high-tension symphony of grinding gears, snapping timber, and panicked shouting over the secure radio lines of the pursuers. Leo drove with a desperate, intuitive skill he hadn't known he possessed, utilizing his latent knowledge of physics and trajectory to navigate the impossible terrain. The sequence was a series of rapid cuts, the black SUVs fishtailing wildly on loose gravel, the brothers' truck slamming through a small, overgrown creek bed, water spraying high into the morning light, the screech of tires spinning uselessly as they struggled to climb a treacherously steep, forested incline. The antagonist's vehicles were more powerful, heavier, and quickly closing the gap. Leo fought the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his adrenaline surging. He knew they couldn't outrun power. They had to outsmart it. This was not about speed. This was about survival in a landscape that only the underdogs truly understood. Every mile gained was a moment, bought with sheer, reckless desperation. Mid-chase, deep in the unfamiliar territory of the mountain's far side, the syndicate's first SUV suddenly spun out of control, its front axle buckling with a terrible, grinding shriek of stressed metal. It wasn't a driving error. The high-powered vehicle simply dropped into a hole that shouldn't have been there. Leo, watching the crash in his rearview mirror, instantly recognized the cause. A hidden, shallow ditch covered perfectly by expertly placed layers of pine needles and decaying leaves. A deliberate, localized terrain alteration. He glanced at Sam, and a terrible, brilliant realization dawned on them both. Foreshadowing was now materializing into physical, life-saving obstacles. Their great-uncle Silas, the paranoid, brilliant engineer, hadn't just secured the gold, he had also secured the escape route. Sam snatched the journal, flipping to a barely legible section about maintenance of the paths. The old man had spent years quietly and systematically setting up a series of minor booby traps and decoys along the most likely back trails. Small, inconspicuous engineering feats designed to slow down any pursuit. The second SUV, seeing the wreckage of the first, slammed on its brakes, its occupants momentarily stunned by the sudden, inexplicable obstacle. The brief, crucial hesitation was all the brothers needed. They burst out of the tree line and onto an old, forgotten, state-maintained gravel road. the tires of the old pickup finally biting into firm ground. They were clear for now. They had survived not through mere luck, but through the deliberate, generations-long planning of a man who refused to be defeated. They had utilized Silas's wisdom and their own rough, latent skills to successfully outsmart and outrun the institutional power that was built on his betrayal. The dramatic irony was immense. The antagonists had failed to realize the man they had blacklisted was still playing a sophisticated long-term game, a game their own corporate descendants were now losing, one deliberately broken axle at a time. The long drive to the university town was a blur of grinding urgency and cheap gas station coffee. The brothers, smelling of sweat, mountain dust, and the metallic tang of fear, finally pulled up to the ivy-covered, imposing office of Professor Elias Eldridge. The historian was a man wizened by age and academic rigor, his expression initially one of profound, weary skepticism, a clear defense against decades of dealing with eccentric claims and fringe theories. He was their last hope, and he looked entirely unconvinced. Leo and Sam laid out their desperate evidence on his immaculate oak desk, the brittle annotated journal open to Silas's first accusation of corporate theft, and the small, heavy, ingot-sized gold bar. Eldridge dismissed the journal first, waving it away with a sigh of tolerance as an old man's delusion, a conspiracy theory written in spidery ink. But then, Sam pushed the gold bar across the desk. Eldridge picked it up, his fingers, which had spent a lifetime turning fragile pages, tracing the bar's impossible density. He turned it over, his eyes landing on the unique, stylized, 5-digit serial number and the initials WMD. His eyes, which had been dull with professional skepticism, snapped open, suddenly bright and shocked. "I know this stamp," he whispered, his voice cracking with the force of delayed recognition. "I dismissed it as folklore, an old tale told by the prospectors that no one could ever prove." Eldridge recognized the unique assay mark because he had seen it, referenced in a single destroyed state record from 1947, a record he had spent his career trying to authenticate. The skepticism vanished, replaced by a profound, shaking certainty. The final layer of dramatic irony peeled away. The historian was suddenly staring at the irrefutable physical proof that his most controversial, most ridiculed theories were, in fact, devastating facts. He was staring at the undeniable truth that the foundation of a modern corporation was built on a crime. The key information delivery was complete, transforming Eldridge from a passive observer into a terrified but vital ally. Before Eldridge could fully process the gravity of the gold bar resting in his palm, Leo's phone lit up with a legal notification. A massive, corporate-backed lawsuit had been filed with shattering speed. The plaintiff, Haraway Corporation. The defendants, Leo and Sam Thorne. The charges were comprehensive and designed to be terrifying. Grand larceny, criminal trespassing, and interruption of legally secured subterranean assets. The institutional power had formally engaged, using the weight of the law as a weapon. The suit cited the original 1940s land deed the syndicate had used to frame Silas, claiming absolute ownership of the remote mountain land and all mineral assets and resources contained therein. This was the climax of the corporate threat, a carefully calculated move to seize the narrative and the evidence through overwhelming legal force. Eldridge, the historian, instantly recognized the classic maneuver. He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound startling in the quiet office. "This is a tipping point," he declared, his face grim. "They're trying to use legal weight to bury the evidence. If they can legally establish they own the land, they own the gold, and your great-uncle's claim becomes theft." Haraway wasn't interested in a fair fight. They were interested in making the evidence disappear. By claiming the land and the gold, They could seize the chamber, deny the historical contents, and seal the tomb forever, making Silas's entire lifetime of work a simple, final act of criminal trespass. The brothers understood the stakes instantly. The fight was no longer in the tunnels, it was in the court of law, a field where their poverty and lack of resources were the greatest vulnerability. The immense, well-resourced corporation was moving to crush the underdogs under a mountain of paperwork, transforming their stunning discovery into a crippling liability. They had the physical proof of the conspiracy, but without a credible counter-move, the entire truth would be extinguished by the institutional power in a matter of days. The legal threat from Haraway Corporation was shocking, but it was Professor Eldridge's next words that truly turned the tide from a desperate historical find into a monumental historical vindication. The old historian sat back in his chair, his eyes distant, fixed on a wall where memory was, suddenly more real than plaster. He drew a deep, shuddering breath. "I was an apprentice," he confessed, his voice a low, rough whisper. "A young, frightened clerk in the local land office. I was there that day." He looked directly at Leo and Sam, his face etched with 8 decades of silent guilt and professional shame. "I witnessed it." He recounted the day in 1948, when Silas Thorne, gaunt and defeated, was dragged screaming from the property by 2 enormous black-suited men, the hired hands from the original Western Mining and Development. Eldridge had been responsible for filing the very deed that the company claimed made them owners, a document he now knew to be fraudulent. He described the look in Silas's eyes, a hollow-eyed look of absolute betrayal, and the shame that Eldridge himself carried for not speaking up then. He had prioritized his own career over the moral conviction he should have had. The company had pressured him, whispering threats about lost jobs and ruined futures. "They said he was a madman who had trespassed," Eldridge said, his voice gaining strength, resonating with the force of delayed justice. "But I saw what they did to him. I saw them hide the original deed. I saw them falsify the reports." His confession was a profound, powerful act of moral cleansing. The journal was the proof, the gold was the evidence, but Eldridge was the witness, the essential human element capable of exposing the institutional lie. The old professor, his eyes now bright with a furious, long-dormant zeal, slapped his hand on the desk. "Haraway Corporation wants to bury this in a legal filing," he declared, "but they will not. I will testify. I have spent my life writing the footnotes of this secret history. Now, I will write the final chapter." The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The legal threat from the Haraway Corporation was massive, calculated to freeze the brothers through fear and legal complexity. Eldridge knew the courts would move slowly, but the company's security teams on the mountain would move fast, likely seizing the gold and planting false evidence the moment the lawsuit distracted the authorities. They needed a strategic move, a counterpunch that leveraged the antagonist's own arrogance. Eldridge, the man of academia now turned operative, devised the strategy, a dangerous public bait and switch. He utilized his quiet, established contacts in the historical and geological communities, carefully leaking a precisely crafted, partial truth. The story, which began to circulate among academic blogs and fringe mining news sites, did not mention the vault, the tonnage of gold, or the specific assay stamp. It claimed only that the Thorne brothers had stumbled upon irrefutable, new evidence of a previously unknown gold mine on the property once held by the former Western Mining and Development. The leak was simple, believable, and crucially, only half true. The regional media picked it up immediately, a compelling tale of poor inheritors and historical secrets. The purpose was twofold. First, it alerted the state mining authorities, forcing a public, official inquiry into the site. Second, and far more vital, it was designed to draw the syndicate out. Haraway Corporation, utterly confident that they could legally claim any discovered mine through their existing land deeds, would be forced to react publicly and immediately. Their corporate ego, their entrenched institutional arrogance, demanded they secure the site before the state intervened. Their action would force them to send their most recognizable, highest-level executives, the physical embodiment of the institutional power, to the mountain, directly into the trap the brothers were setting. Leo and Sam, using the media noise as cover, began coordinating with a distant, incorruptible federal agency, preparing to return to the mountain, armed not with shovels, but with the journal and the signed deed. The dramatic irony was now a ticking clock. The antagonists were walking into a carefully engineered ambush, convinced they were simply securing a valuable resource they already owned. The corporate world moved with predictable, arrogant speed, taking the bait exactly as Eldridge had predicted. The black, unmarked SUVs of the security detail were replaced by a sleek, intimidating motorcade, evidence that this was no longer a sweep, but an executive operation. Sam, monitoring the communications, confirmed the target. Mr. Julian Haraway, the current CEO of the Haraway Corporation, the grandson of the original antagonist, and the cold, entitled face of the institutional power. The brothers, their faces grim but resolute, slipped back into the mountain and waited, positioned strategically near the mouth of the hidden tunnel. The air, already thick with history, now crackled with the tension peak. Julian Haraway emerged from his car, impeccably tailored and radiating disdain for the derelict cabin and the rugged landscape. He was surrounded by a phalanx of silent, well-paid security and a team of corporate engineers tasked with securing the asset. With contemptuous efficiency, Haraway found the trapdoor, which the brothers had intentionally left askew, and descended into the shaft. He was smiling, assured of his victory. This was the moment of confrontation. The CEO, surrounded by his men, finally pushed past the vault door, which Leo and Sam had left unlocked, a subtle piece of theater. He stepped into the massive, engineered chamber, his tactical flashlight sweeping over the stacked crates. He saw the gleam of the gold, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of raw, unrecorded wealth. His smile widened into a self-satisfied sneer, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "It's all here," he stated into his secure microphone, the sound arrogant and final. "A family folly, a lucky break for us. Thorne's madness ends today." He stood in the heart of his family's ancient crime, utterly convinced of his triumph and the utter defeat of the poor, simple men who had found it. The antagonist was gloating, perfectly positioned, completely unaware that the underdogs were already in place behind him, and that the distant, federal agents they had quietly brought into the mountain were now moving into position at the tunnel's outer approaches. The trap was sprung. Julian Haraway stood over the mountain of raw gold, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the rough stone of the chamber, his face alight with cold, arrogant triumph. He was in the process of ordering his engineers to begin the delicate work of removing the gold, when a voice, rough with the accumulated hardship of the mountains and the years of poverty, echoed from the darkness of the passage. "It ends today, Mr. Haraway, but not for us." Sam and Leo stepped fully into the light, their faces grim but resolute, flanked by the distant, silent figures of the federal agents who had patiently waited in the tunnel's outer approaches. Julian Haraway's corporate composure fractured into sheer, blinding rage. He barked an order for his security to move, but the federal agents, clean, incorruptible, and armed with a legitimate warrant secured on Eldridge's testimony, moved faster, efficiently neutralizing the syndicate's hired muscle. Haraway, enraged, pointed at the glittering wealth. "This is a civil matter. This land and everything beneath it belongs to my corporation. We will sue you into bankruptcy and jail, he thundered, his voice echoing fiercely in the massive stone chamber. Leo stepped forward, holding the final, most fragile piece of evidence, a document taken from the last, most carefully sealed compartment of Silas's journal. It belongs to the Thorne family, Mr. Haraway, Leo stated, his voice clear and authoritative, a sharp retort to the CEO's bluster. Your grandfather stole it, and your corporation has maintained the lie. But Silas was prepared for this day. He unrolled the brittle, yellow document. It was a formal, legally witnessed, signed deed of abandonment by the original syndicate owners, dated 1947, a mere week before they framed Silas. To protect themselves from the newly enacted federal treaties, they had legally abandoned the claim, making the site res nullius, a property belonging to no one. Silas, their betrayed engineer, had immediately and legally jumped the claim, securing the land with his own meager savings before the syndicate could file its own false ownership papers. The deed, a perfect example of Silas's engineering of truth, proved that Julian Haraway's entire corporate fortune was built on a crime, and the entire fortune was, legally and morally, the legacy of Silas Thorne. The immediate reaction to the forged deed was absolute and devastating. Julian Haraway's face turned an immediate, sickening shade of ash as his own corporate lawyers, who had accompanied him into the subterranean chamber, confirmed the terrifying authenticity of the signed deed of abandonment. They had never known it existed. Their entire legal edifice, their family's power, was built on the lie of the 1948 false filing. The moral arc of the story, which had bent toward injustice for 80 years, had finally, violently snapped back toward justice. The CEO's frantic demands for his security team to intervene were silenced by the firm, quiet authority of the federal agents. Julian Haraway, the entitled face of institutional power, was publicly placed under federal arrest right there in the glittering, claustrophobic vault for corporate fraud and theft of a historic claim. His security detail was disarmed, and the gold, the massive, undeniable evidence, was immediately seized and placed under judicial review. This was the long-awaited moment of uplifting resolution for the two poor brothers. They stood side by side in the heart of the vault, watching as the vast, unseen institution that had crushed their family for generations was finally, definitively dismantled. The narrative shifted from the darkness of conspiracy to the blinding, absolute light of truth. Professor Eldridge, the courageous witness, entered the chamber and embraced Sam and Leo. "You have done more than save yourselves," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have rewritten the history of this region. You have proven that even the smallest, most broken legacy can stand against the biggest, most entrenched power." The brothers were formally acknowledged as the legal discoverers and inheritors of the rightful claim, their moral vindication complete, and the second chance they had prayed for was now a tangible, gleaming reality resting in the hands of the law. The underdogs had not just won, they had corrected history. The legal fallout from the discovery and the ensuing public firestorm was seismic, echoing through state capitals and corporate boardrooms for years. The Haraway Corporation, stripped bare by the irrefutable evidence of the signed abandonment deed, was forced into receivership, its empire of institutional theft finally collapsing under the weight of Silas Thorne's expertly preserved truth. The gold itself was subjected to a complex judicial settlement, but the final ruling was clear. The Thorne brothers received a significant and undisputed portion of the find, a fortune large enough to fundamentally restart their lives and the lives of their whole community. The underdogs were victorious. They didn't take their immense wealth and disappear into a life of ease. They honored Silas's legacy and their hard-won sense of redemption. Leo, the failed planner, used his share to establish a foundation focused on ethical land stewardship and supporting small local builders, finally utilizing his latent skill for the good of his neighbors. Sam, the former drifter, invested in a local youth mechanics program, giving second chances to kids who, like him, had felt lost and failed, their potential wasted by poverty. They eventually sold the derelict cabin, but they kept the deed to the mountain land, now a testament to their family's resilience and a monument to truth. They stood outside the rebuilt shell of the cabin one last time, looking at the vast, distant sunset. They were no longer hungry or hollow-eyed, but hopeful. They had fought the system, and with the help of a brilliant, bitter, dead engineer, they had won. The mountain, once a symbol of their poverty and despair, had become a permanent symbol of their truth. Their story, the story of two poor brothers and a secret buried for 80 years, was complete.